I was slowing down on a rural road in Ohio when someone hit my window so hard I thought it was going to shatter. When I looked to the side, I saw a woman with her face covered in blood, desperate, screaming something that I couldn't understand at first. She pointed behind my truck and said that there were people involved, that I needed to stop right there. I've been in the business for over 16 years, and I know how certain situations can arise far too quickly to be considered normal. In that second, with the engine still running and my foot on the brake, I had to decide whether to open the door or keep the truck moving. I had left Toledo shortly before midnight with dry cargo, palletized automotive parts, sealed at the distribution center. Simple delivery, short route to a smaller warehouse near the state border. Nothing out of the ordinary for what I've been doing for years. It was one of those back roads that cut through farms, a narrow stretch with zero lighting and almost no traffic after 10 o'clock. The weather was cold, the sky clear, but dark enough that the high beams became the only reference point for depth. I chose that route because it saved almost 40 minutes, and it's usually too quiet at that time of day. The traffic had completely disappeared after I left the main highway. No cars coming in the opposite direction, no distant headlights behind me, and no sign of a nearby house. The radio volume was low, with only occasional static from the cable, and the dashboard indicated a reduced speed due to the sharp curves. The asphalt there isn't the best, full of patches and small undulations that make the trailer pull slightly. Even so, nothing justified someone suddenly appearing on the side of the truck as happened. I tend to keep my distance from anything that looks like an accident on a rural road at night. I've seen people use cars positioned across the road to force vehicles to stop, especially near areas known for auto dismantling. In that specific region, years ago, there were reports of cargo disappearing after suspicious stops. It wasn't a frequent occurrence, but it was enough for the company to warn against opening the door to anyone outside of a clearly lit post. Even so, up until that moment, I hadn't seen a stopped car, flashing lights, or any sign of a recent collision. The trailer was sealed, and I had checked the seal before leaving. No warning lights on the dashboard, no open door alerts, no unusual vibrations. The only thing that was different was the feeling that the road was too quiet, as if the air were still. I was paying close attention to the sides because the grass grows tall there, and I almost ran over a deer in that area before. But I didn't see anyone come out of the bushes before that bang on the window. The curious thing is that I had passed through a dirt intersection about 2 minutes before. There are usually recent tire tracks there when farmers drive past with pickup trucks, but that night it was all too slippery. No dust suspended above the air, no distant beacon indicating parallel movement. I even thought that maybe there was someone stopped further ahead with their headlights off, waiting for an opportunity. When she appeared at my door, the only certainty I had was that I hadn't seen her arrive. With my foot still on the brake and the truck almost stopping instinctively, my hand remained suspended near the door unlock button. She kept pointing behind the trailer, yelling that people were tampering with the cargo. I quickly glanced at the dashboard looking for any warning signs of a tampering or pressure drop in the doors, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. The rearview mirror showed only the dark side of the trunk reflecting my own headlight, with no moving shadow. Even so, the way she insisted made it seem like I was ignoring something too urgent to question. My first impulse was to pull over completely and turn on the hazard lights, as protocol dictates when someone calls for help. But there was one small thing that didn't add up. Something about her posture that seemed too rehearsed. She wasn't looking at the trailer as if she were afraid someone was coming out of it. She was looking directly at me the whole time. His hands pounded on the glass forcefully, but without any real tremor, as if he were gauging my reaction. I've seen real accidents, and the despair is usually confusing, not very focused. My head started to feel heavy with two simple but bad options. If it were true and I ignored it, someone could really be trapped or armed back there. If it were a lie and I opened the door, I would be offering the cabin on a platter on an unlit road. I've spent 19 years hauling cargo across this country, and I've learned that making the wrong decision in the wrong place doesn't give you a second chance. The truck was heavy enough to react slowly if something went wrong. I reached for the CB radio almost reflexively, thinking of calling anyone on the local frequency. All I heard was static, nothing but my own hissing sound coming back. She realized I hadn't unlocked the door and began to change her tone. Less shouting, more controlled urgency. That's what bothered me the most because it seemed like an adjustment, not panic. That's when I decided not to stop completely and keep the truck rolling, even if slowly. When I took my foot off the brake and let the vehicle move forward a few meters, she kept walking alongside the cab for too long. No one can keep up that pace on uneven gravel without tripping or looking at the ground. I felt that there were other people there besides her, even though I hadn't seen anyone yet. The next curve was about 50 meters ahead, a blind spot for anyone waiting. I needed to decide before going in, because after that, I wouldn't have any view of what was around me. As I entered the curve, I saw in the high beam what had previously been out of my field of vision. A dark car was partially blocking the lane, not completely obstructing it, but enough to force me to slow down even more. The lights were off, and there were no hazard lights on, which made absolutely no sense in that situation. The woman stopped banging on the window the moment the car appeared in front of her, as if it were all part of the same scene. It was then that I felt that the decision I had made a few seconds earlier was still not enough. I kept the truck moving slowly, assessing the space to the right and left, to swerve without losing traction. The rearview mirror revealed something that wasn't there before, a shadow emanating from the side of the parked car. It wasn't possible to see a face, but it was possible to see the posture, too still for someone who was helping a victim. The woman was no longer yelling about men in the trailer. Now she just told me to stop because it was dangerous to continue. The curious thing is that nobody seemed concerned about their own safety in the middle of that dark runway. My heart started beating faster, but my head went strangely cold. I realized that the car in front wasn't blocking my path by accident. It was positioned to control my trajectory. The road there was narrow with ditches on both sides and no usable shoulder for a vehicle of that size. Looking in the side mirror, I noticed another quick movement coming from the bushes, too low to be a branch swaying in the wind. At that point, it was no longer about helping someone, it was about getting out of there before they closed the place off completely. Before I could even decide what to do, a second vehicle appeared behind me without its high beams on, closing the distance too quickly. I didn't hear any approaching engines before, which means they were already positioned outside my field of vision. The car in front adjusted the angle slightly, not completely blocking it, but forcing me to line up exactly where they wanted. The woman calmly moved away from the cabin door. She didn't run, she didn't stumble, she simply stepped aside as if she already knew what to do next. It was at that moment that I understood that the consequences had already begun, even though I hadn't stopped completely. One of the men took 2 steps into the beam of my headlights and raised his arm as a signal for me to turn off the engine. He didn't seem nervous, he didn't seem to be improvising, he seemed routine. I saw something metallic in his hand reflecting light for a second, enough to dispel any doubt about his intentions. The vehicle behind me moved closer, blocking my rear in a way that left me with no room to back up with the vehicle. They didn't scream, they didn't run. They just waited for me to make the expected mistake. It was there that my breathing changed rhythm, and my hand slowly released from the brake. If I turned off the engine, I would relinquish complete control of the situation. If I accelerated incorrectly, I could lose traction and end up stuck sideways in my own differential lock. The car ahead was just a few meters from my reinforced bumper, positioned exactly where a light vehicle wouldn't withstand a direct impact. I wasn't thinking about cargo, company, or reports at that moment. I was only thinking about creating space before someone arrived at my door. I floored the accelerator and felt the torque pushing the whole thing forward without warning to anyone. The bull bar struck the rear of the car with a sharp, metal-on-metal impact, enough to move the vehicle several meters off the track. The sound was loud inside the cabin, but what stood out most was the vibration traveling up through the steering wheel as I kept a firm grip on the steering. The man in front backed up too quickly to remain confident, and the car behind hesitated for a second before attempting to adjust its position. That second was all I needed to align the truck and get through the gap that opened up. I didn't stop to look in the rearview mirror immediately. I just kept the truck steady until I exited the curve and gained a few meters of distance. When I finally looked, I saw headlights rearranging themselves behind me, but they were no longer as close together as before. There wasn't a long chase, perhaps because the damage to the car ahead was greater than they expected. The radio was still silent and the road seemed empty again, just as it had been minutes before, only now nothing there seemed neutral. I continued driving for almost 40 minutes without slowing down below the speed limit until I reached a larger highway with proper lighting. Later, the state police registered the incident and found the abandoned car a few kilometers away. Irregular license plate, with no clear owner record, typical of a vehicle used for quick crimes and immediate disposal. My truck sustained structural damage to the reinforced bumper and a visible dent, enough to warrant a report, and days of downtime for assessment. The cargo was not tampered with, but the impact cost time, money, and required a lengthy explanation for the insurance company. Operationally, I managed to get out unscathed, but the way it was set up stayed with me ever since. After that day, I began to see rural roads at night in a different way. It's not about constant fear. It's about understanding that certain scenes can be staged to provoke exactly the reaction they expect from you. I still drive, I still pick up night loads when needed, I still cross state lines like I always have. But I reduce the speed differently now, I observe differently, and most importantly, I don't turn off the engine in places where I don't have control of the space. There are situations that seem like a cry for help, but they actually function as a test of decision-making under pressure. I don't like the rule I created for myself after that. It's too simple and sometimes too harsh, especially when it involves someone who appears to be injured on the side of the road. But on that road in Ohio, I learned that the first mistake isn't believing, it's stopping completely. Some traps don't rely on brute force, they rely on seconds of hesitation. And I'm not giving anyone those few seconds in the dark anymore. Look, if you think these stories need to reach more drivers so they're on alert, you're like, it's the most powerful tool we have here. When you like and leave a comment, YouTube understands that this content is important and starts recommending it to the entire road community. Tell me in the comments, what city are you listening from and what time is it now? Let's see who's on the night shift tonight. My name is Marcus Hale. I am 38 years old, and I know every object I carry in my cabin like the back of my hand. That morning, at a 24-hour gas station in Florida, I lowered the sun visor just to block the glare of the white light on the windshield. Something slid slowly and fell into my lap, too light to be a tool, too heavy to be ordinary paper. For a second I stood there, trying to remember if I had put that there myself at some point during the trip. The gas station was packed, engines roaring all around, people walking between the pumps, but inside the cabin it felt like I was far too alone for that hour. I was doing a regular route between Jacksonville and Tampa, carrying dry cargo of cleaning products, nothing sensitive, nothing that would attract special attention. The delivery was scheduled for early the next morning, so I stopped at that large gas station because I needed to adjust the time on the ELD and grab a coffee. It was one of those gas stations that were never empty, with trucks lined up, lights that were too bright, and people constantly coming and going. The environment gives a sense of security precisely because it is too busy for anything strange to happen. I had made that stop before and I never had a problem there. The vehicle was parked in a side space. It wasn't the best position, but it offered a partial view of the inner lane. I had left the cabin about 15 minutes earlier to use the bathroom and buy a large coffee. I didn't linger, I didn't leave the door open, and I have a habit of always locking the cabin even at a busy gas station. When I returned, nothing seemed out of place at first glance. The seat was in the same position, the dashboard was normal, and the door closed securely. It was only when I sat down and adjusted the parasol that feeling started to bother me. The photo was still in my lap as I tried to mentally reconstruct the last movements. I didn't let anyone into the cabin. I didn't give them a ride. I didn't authorize maintenance. Nothing that would justify having a new object in there. The strangest detail was that it wasn't lying on the floor or on the dashboard. It was hidden in a spot where someone would need to know that I used that space. I've been driving long enough to know that truckers tend to accumulate things scattered around, but I'm too organized not to notice something new. And that was definitely not part of my routine. I looked around through the window, trying to see if anyone was watching my reaction. There was a driver talking near the pump 2 aisles ahead, a worker collecting trash, and a couple arguing near the convenience store. Everything was too ordinary to match the feeling that began to creep up my spine. The gas station was noisy, but inside the cabin it seemed like the sound had decreased, as if I were isolated from everything else. I hadn't even fully opened the photo yet, and I already knew that wasn't a coincidence. Before unfolding the paper completely, I thought of only one thing. If someone put that there, that person had enough time and access to change it wherever they wanted. There were no signs of forced entry, no forced glass, and no broken lock. Either I had failed at something simple, or someone had too easily come and go without leaving a trace. And I don't like either of those possibilities. I unfolded the photo slowly, as if opening it quickly might change what was printed there. It was the front of my house, taken from the sidewalk across the street, at a slightly tilted angle as if the photographer were inside a car. My son's bedroom window was clearly visible, the curtain partially open as it usually is when he forgets to pull it properly. There was no date written on it, no message on the back, just an image that was too clean to be old. My first impulse was to pick up the phone and call home, but I stood still for a few seconds before doing anything. I looked again inside the cabin, searching for anything out of place besides the photo. Console closed, backpack in the same corner, documents inside the overhead compartment. Nothing rummaged through. If someone went in there, they went in calmly enough not to leave a visible mark. What bothered me most was the fact that the photo was hidden in the sunshade, not just randomly placed there. That seemed like a targeted message, not a widespread threat. I finally called home pretending to be nonchalant, asking simple things like someone who just wants to know if everything is okay. My wife said the night was quiet, that she hadn't seen anything strange on the street. I could hear the television in the background and my son laughing at something, a normal end-of-day routine. Even so, while I was talking, I kept looking in the side mirror as if someone might be standing outside watching me. It was there that I decided that before leaving that post, I needed to understand if it was just intimidation or part of something bigger. After the call, I couldn't simply start the car and continue my journey as if it were just a poorly explained scare. I began to look at the cabin with a different kind of attention, opening compartment after compartment without making a fuss. Nothing seemed forced open, nothing broken, but there was a strange feeling that something had been touched and put back in its place. When I pulled the rubber mat from the passenger side, I felt that it was slightly misaligned. It might have been my imagination, but I don't usually touch that area during a quick stop. I leaned down and ran my hand behind the side panel, where the wires and small electronic modules are located. That's when I felt something taped on that wasn't part of the original set. Small, discreet, fitted too cleanly to be a trucker's makeshift repair. It wasn't company equipment. I'm familiar with the installation standard on my own truck. That's when I understood that the photo wasn't just an isolated warning. It was confirmation that someone had entered there with a purpose. While I was still evaluating that, my phone vibrated on the dashboard with an unknown number. It wasn't a typical telemarketing call. There was no caller ID whatsoever. I let it ring a few times before answering, trying to control my breathing so as not to show nervousness, even to myself. When I put the device to my ear, there was no greeting, just controlled silence from the other end. And then a calm voice asked if I had already found what was hidden inside the cabin. I didn't respond immediately. I just remained silent, trying to understand how far this had gone out of my control. The voice on the other end remained calm, saying that I didn't need to worry if I cooperated and continued driving normally. He said that certain things were already in place and that any wrong move would put my family in a difficult situation. There was no direct threat, no shouting, and that's precisely what made the message more impactful. I realized that the consequences wouldn't begin when the police showed up. They were already underway at that moment. While holding the phone, I looked again at the spot where I found the device stuck behind the dashboard. If it was transmitting location data, someone knew exactly where I was standing. The crowded gas station no longer felt like protection. It felt like an open stage for anything to happen. The voice told me that I just needed to continue the route, deliver the cargo, and not touch anything inside the cabin. The problem is that I had already messed with it. I hung up without arguing, because arguing wouldn't change the fact that someone had entered there without me noticing. My mind began to coldly organize the possibilities, even with a knot in my stomach. If there was one device, there could be more than one, and perhaps something I hadn't yet found. I knew that if I simply continued my journey, I would be obeying someone who had demonstrated knowledge of where my family lived, And I also knew that if I were stopped on the road by any authority, I wouldn't have an immediate explanation for what was hidden there. I didn't leave the post immediately, but I also didn't stay long enough to look like I was waiting for someone. I drove a few kilometers along the main highway, maintaining a steady speed, as if I were simply resuming my route. Instead of heading to the cargo's destination, I started mentally calculating which federal base was closest in that stretch of Florida. It wasn't a simple decision, because involving authority meant taking a risk even before understanding the magnitude of the problem. But continuing to drive under the instructions of someone who had a photo of my house was not an option I would accept. While driving, I found two more strange spots in the cabin that I had never noticed before. A small side compartment appeared to have been opened and closed recently, although there were no obvious signs of forced entry. Inside, nestled among old manuals and insurance documents, were compact packages sealed in a manner too professional to be ordinary disposable items. I didn't need to open it to understand that it wasn't part of my declared cargo. It became clear then that it wasn't just monitoring. It was a complete setup to transform me into something I didn't choose to be. I drove straight into the parking lot of a federal base without honking, without drawing attention, just parking in the area designated for visitors. I left the booth with my hands visible before anyone even asked anything. I explained briefly that I needed to speak to someone in charge and that I didn't want this to be treated as a common roadside encounter. It was embarrassing, it was tense, but it was the only way to stop the situation from getting out of control. Operationally, my shipment was delayed, my truck was held for inspection, and my life took a turn I hadn't planned when I started that simple route. After that day, I never returned to the same house that appears in that photo. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It was part of what came after I explained everything and agreed to cooperate. My name remains Marcus Hale for those who knew me before, but officially I now exist in a different way, in a different state. The company resolved the cargo issue. The insurance company covered the operational losses, but that was a minor detail in the story. What really changed was the notion that the cabin is never completely private. I still drive, but not with the same kind of quiet confidence I used to have. I inspect the dashboard, carpet, compartment, and even the sun visor with an almost obsessive attention to detail. A crowded gas station no longer meant automatic safety for me. Too much movement can hide too much, and that's exactly what happened that morning. The feeling of being invaded doesn't make a sound. It just stays. Sometimes I think it all started with a piece of paper that was too light to cause physical damage, but the real weight wasn't in the photo. It was in the certainty that someone came in, rummaged around, and left without me noticing. There was no chase, no shooting, no open confrontation on the road. It was quiet, organized, and almost too efficient. And I know that if I had ignored that detail on the sun visor, maybe today I would be responsible for something I didn't do. I'm sending this account because it took me a while to accept what really happened on that downhill stretch in Colorado, and I think another driver might notice the signs sooner than I did. I was already in the middle of the mountain road, the track damp with old snow on the sides, controlling the weight with engine braking as I have done for years. The truck reacted in a slightly different way. Nothing that screamed immediate danger, but enough to make me pay extra attention. When I looked at the panel, something appeared that wasn't a typical system warning, nor standard technical code that we learned to recognize. What bothered me wasn't just the message itself. It was the feeling that it was already happening before I even noticed. I was hauling refrigerated cargo from Grand Junction to Denver, a tight delivery schedule due to the receiving window. It was early morning. The temperature was low, but the road was still open with only a buildup of old snow on the edges. I know that stretch of road. I've driven down that mountain several times in winter, so it wasn't new to me. The truck had been serviced, maintenance was done on schedule, and there were no outstanding issues in the company's report. There was no prior technical reason to expect any unusual behavior from that assembly. Before starting the longest descent, I downshifted and engaged engine braking at the usual level. Controlled speed, safe distance from the next curve, nothing out of the ordinary. The ELD showed everything as normal, with no warnings of failures or unstable communication. I was alone on that stretch of road, no cars tailgating behind me, no trucks ahead holding up traffic. It was a clean descent, the kind that requires attention, but not excessive tension. What started to bother me was something almost imperceptible while pedaling. A slight difference in resistance occurred when I applied the service brake to adjust speed before a tighter turn. It wasn't a complete failure. It wasn't a total loss. Just a response that didn't match the pressure applied. I let go, stepped on it again, and the behavior changed again, as if it were adjusting on its own. That's when I started to suspect that the flashing panel wasn't just an isolated coincidence. The warning kept appearing for a few seconds and then disappearing without generating a fixed error code. It was not accompanied by a loud, audible alarm, which is what normally happens when there is a real risk to the system. It was too subtle to be a serious flaw and too strange to be a passing bug. I thought about stopping at the first emergency pull-off, but I was still far from the next safe point. And in that stretch of road, stopping on any improvised shoulder can be more risky than continuing to drive. I continued down, paying close attention to the truck's every reaction. Hands firmly on the steering wheel, eyes switching between the road and the dashboard at intervals too short to be comfortable. The weight of the load helped with stability, but it also increased the responsibility for any miscalculation. There was no smell of burning brakes, no strong vibration in the axle. Nothing alarming yet. Just that persistent feeling that something was working outside of my control. When the warning reappeared on the dashboard for the third time, I had to decide whether to ignore it as an intermittent glitch or treat it as something more serious. It wasn't a long message, nor was it standard code that I could look up in the manual kept behind the seat. It was too short, too direct, and it disappeared before I could fully grasp it in my head. I thought about reducing the speed even further, but at that point in the descent, that could lead to excessive weight accumulation on the vehicle. Holding the brakes too tightly isn't the solution either, especially when driving on a mountain road with a wet surface. I took my foot off the service brake and let only the engine brake work for a few seconds. The truck responded well for a moment as if nothing was out of the ordinary. Then I felt a slight intervention that I hadn't controlled, a minimal correction in the rotation. It wasn't abrupt, but it didn't come from me. It was as if the system had decided to adjust something without waiting for my direct command. I am 45 years old, and I have driven both old trucks with no electronics whatsoever and new models full of digital assistance. I know how to differentiate between human error and system interference. On that descent, what bothered me wasn't a traditional mechanical failure. It was the feeling that control was being shared without my authorization. I reached for the off button for certain electronic assistance, thinking of taking over everything manually. But before I could press anything, the panel flashed again, this time long enough for me to read each word clearly. The message reappeared on the screen, but this time it stayed for a few seconds longer than before. It wasn't standard technical code. It didn't refer to a specific sensor or module. It was too straightforward, almost as if it had been written to be understood without a manual. I felt a slight chill run down my spine, not from panic, but from recognizing that this didn't fit the mold of a normal mechanical failure. And in the middle of the descent, anything that doesn't fit becomes an immediate priority. I kept my hands firmly on the steering wheel and eased off the pedal to let only engine braking do its work. For a moment the truck stabilized, rotation under control, response predictable. Then came a small automatic brake application that I hadn't ordered. It wasn't abrupt, but it was enough to transfer weight forward at the wrong point in the curve. I felt the axis respond differently, as if the balance had been adjusted by a decision other than my own. I tried disabling secondary electronic assistance to handle everything manually. Some commands responded, others seemed to take longer than they should have. The panel would blink, disappear, and reappear, always without registering a permanent fault. There was no loud, audible alarm, just that intermittent visual insistence. It was too discreet to be a total malfunction and too intrusive to be a simple bug. The smell of brakes started to appear sooner than would be expected for that incline. I wasn't pressing with continuous force. I was alternating as the procedure dictates. Even so, I felt a slight warmth beyond the normal, something that indicated the application wasn't solely my own doing. I looked at the track ahead, calculating the distance to the next runoff area. There were still a few kilometers to go before the nearest ramp. That's when I realized it wasn't just a delayed response. It was interference from the command system. The truck was reacting to me, but it was also reacting to something invisible in the system. I hadn't lost total control, but he was no longer exclusively mine. On that downhill stretch with snow on the edges and a sharp bend ahead, sharing control was not a safe option. And I had to decide quickly whether to trust the system or prepare to abandon the truck. Before I could even begin to make a mental diagnosis, the service brake was applied with more force than I had put on the pedal. It wasn't a complete lockup, but it was enough to generate light smoke coming from the front wheels. The steering wheel vibrated differently, as if the system were trying to correct something that shouldn't be happening. I relieved my foot immediately, but the pressure didn't disappear with the usual response time. That's when I understood that it wasn't just a visual warning. It was a command interfering with the physical parts of the truck. The panel flashed again, and this time the message remained long enough for me to realize that it wasn't a random error. It was not accompanied by a failure recorded in the standard system log. It was as if it were running in parallel to what should have been the official software. I smelled a stronger odor of heated material and mentally calculated how much more uneven braking I could endure on that incline. There was no room to test a hypothesis twice. The escape ramp appeared on the signage a few meters ahead. I knew that going in there meant accepting serious operational losses, perhaps even severe structural damage. But continuing downhill with the brakes being applied outside of my control was an even greater risk. I aligned the truck to the right, preparing to enter the deep gravel area. At that point, the decision wasn't about saving equipment. It was about getting out of that stretch of road alive. I entered the escape ramp with the truck still heavy and partially obstructed. The deep gravel began to slow the vehicle down with controlled violence, throwing weight forward and causing everything inside the cabin to vibrate. The smell of heated brakes mixed with dust rose too quickly, and I felt I couldn't wait for the system to decide anything else for me. I unbuckled my seatbelt and got ready even before the truck completely stopped moving. When the deceleration became unstable, I opened the door and jumped out before the final impact against the retaining wall. I rolled along the side of the ramp, feeling the gravel scrape against my clothes and skin, but I managed to get far enough away. The truck finished sinking into the gravel a few meters ahead, tilted, with the front part partially buried. There was no explosion, no immediate fire, only light steam rising from the superheated system. I sat on the edge of the ramp for a few seconds, trying to catch my breath and understand that I was still in one piece. The silent descent, which began in a controlled manner, ended with the entire structure rendered unusable on that mountain. Then came the emergency teams, technical inspection, report, insurance company, and internal company investigation. The electronic module had alterations that were not part of the original factory standard. Nothing that I could have seen before starting the descent, nothing that would have triggered a clear alert in the exit area. Operationally, the truck was a total loss, and the cargo was compromised by the impact and contamination from the crushed stone. For me, the biggest loss was realizing that blind trust in a connected system can end up on an emergency ramp. I still drive after that, but not in the same way. Whenever I start a long descent, my attention isn't just on the road and the load, it's also on what might be running invisibly within the system. I no longer rely solely on what the dashboard shows or doesn't show. If something out of the ordinary appears, I treat it as a real risk, even if it seems too small at first. It was just one small detail that almost took me off the road that day. The company replaced the truck, the insurance company covered what it could, and the technical report was filed away. But I know that behavior wasn't just a simple, isolated sensor malfunction. Someone meddled where they shouldn't have, or accessed something that shouldn't have been accessed. I don't have complete proof of how it started, I'm only sure of how it ended. And it ended with my truck buried under an emergency ramp. I'm sending this because many people think that technology only makes life easier on the road. It makes things easier, but it also amplifies what can go wrong when someone decides to use it against you. I didn't just lose one truck on that mountain road in Colorado. I lost the feeling that, when descending a mountain, I have 100% control in my hands. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't come back after you've seen how far you can go. If this alert was helpful, hit the like button. It helps the algorithm push this video to more drivers on the road. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next stories. Before you go, comment below with your location and local time. Thanks for riding with me. Safe miles, keep the shiny side up.